A little boy at the dinner table, eyes bright, ready to share a story he's been saving all day. He finally speaks, voice small but excited, and before he can finish, a parent cuts him off with a tired, "Not now," or a sibling laughs at the way he said it. The boy goes quiet instantly. His shoulders drop. He stares at his plate. He doesn't understand why, only that speaking suddenly feels unsafe. Years later, that same boy is you, hesitating before you talk, replaying conversations, shrinking when attention turns your way. Not because you're naturally quiet, but because a long time ago silence felt safer than being misunderstood. Your introversion didn't appear randomly. It began in those tiny childhood moments when your voice met tension instead of warmth, and your nervous system learned its earliest rule: stay quiet to stay safe. Psychologists call this environmentally conditioned introversion, and research from the University of Maryland shows that children raised in homes with high criticism or emotional unpredictability develop elevated amygdala responses, meaning their nervous system becomes wired for caution. To a child, caution looks like silence, and silence eventually becomes identity. You weren't born afraid of speaking. You learned that being too visible could get you laughed at, too emotional could get you dismissed, too expressive could get you compared to someone better. And so your brain created the simplest survival rule it could: stay quiet to stay safe. Maybe it started with one small moment, a joke at the dinner table that earned the wrong kind of laughter, a parent telling you, "Stop overreacting," when you were just overwhelmed, a sibling who was praised for being bold while you were praised for being easy. Tiny moments, yet to a child with no power, tiny moments become entire belief systems. So you adjusted, you shrank, you mastered the art of observing instead of speaking, thinking instead of expressing, pleasing instead of belonging. Here's something most people never realize. Your introversion isn't a flaw, it's a story. A quiet, protective story you started writing long before you had words for fear or safety. It was the way your nervous system kept you out of harm's way, repeating the same patterns because no one ever showed you that the danger had passed. But now, you're older, more aware, and finally able to see the truth behind the quiet, which means something powerful. You're allowed to understand this story, and you're allowed to gently begin rewriting it. To understand why so many adults identify as introverts today, we have to go back, way back, to the version of you that was still loud, curious, and unfiltered. Because no child is born the quiet one. Kids arrive wired for connection. They shout for attention, tug on sleeves, interrupt conversations just to be seen. Quietness isn't natural at the beginning, it's something learned. And like a plant bending toward light, a child bends toward whatever feels safest. In some homes, safety means shrinking their voice. Psychologists call this the emotional climate hypothesis. The idea that your personality forms in response to the atmosphere you grew up in. If your home felt warm, predictable, and emotionally open, you learned that speaking up was safe. But if it felt tense, unpredictable, or quietly critical, your nervous system created a different rule: talk less, feel less, reveal less. Research from Harvard's Center on the Developing Child shows that emotional unpredictability activates a child's stress system the same way physical danger does. A harsh tone can shape a personality just as much as a slammed door. This is how introversion becomes less about temperament and more about emotional strategy. Picture a child noticing their parent's face tighten at the smallest noise, or learning that asking a question at the wrong time leads to frustration. Kids don't analyze, they adapt. They soften their voice, they become careful, they start scanning for safe moments to exist. Over time, quiet becomes their default setting, not a choice, an instinct. Sometimes, The things that shape you are incredibly small. A sigh when you interrupt, an eye roll during your story, a "not now" said too sharply. Adults forget these moments instantly, but children store them like warnings. Memory research shows that the brain holds on to emotional micromoments more strongly than neutral ones. So a single instance of rejection can echo for years inside a child who's still learning their place in the world. But not every difficult childhood is loud. Some are quiet in a way that feels cold. A parent who rarely asks what you're thinking. A parent who listens with their ears but not their heart. A parent who is physically present but emotionally absent. Psychologists call this subdued attachment, where a child learns to self-soothe by withdrawing because reaching out never feels rewarding. Years later, that child might say, "I just like being alone," but underneath, they learn early that solitude was the only safe place. There's also the emotional climate of comparison. If one sibling is the bold, praised one, the quieter child often slips into the background without even noticing. Or if a parent values calmness and obedience, a sensitive child quickly molds themselves into what feels most lovable. It's not their true identity, it's who they needed to become to belong. Slowly, identity becomes negotiation, personality becomes performance. And here's the most honest part. Your introversion didn't appear out of nowhere. It was shaped by the emotional weather you lived under. You didn't just end up quiet, you practiced it. You refined it. You relied on it because for a long time it was the safest way to survive. But now, as an adult, with more clarity than you ever had as a child, you get to ask, is this quietness still protecting me? Or is it a story I've outgrown? Sometimes, the first step toward healing is simply recognizing where the quiet came from in the first place. Most quiet children aren't born quiet, they become quiet. Not because they lack personality, but because they learned early that life feels a little safer when they take up less space. And the things that quiet a child usually aren't dramatic or traumatic. They're small moments repeated over and over, the kind adults forget, but a child's nervous system never does. One of the strongest forces is constant criticism, not the loud kind, but the gentle, daily drip of, "Fix this, why did you do that? You should know better." It feels like guidance to a parent, but to a child it slowly becomes self-surveillance. They double-check their words before speaking. They shrink their ideas before sharing. And by the time they grow up, that protective silence gets mislabeled as calm. Another pattern is emotional dismissal. Maybe you remember standing in a doorway as a kid, tears still on your cheeks, and hearing, "You're too sensitive," or "Stop crying." It sounded small to the adults, but to you it felt like a quiet warning. Your feelings take up too much space. So you learned to shut them down. You cried more quietly, you spoke less. And years later, "I'm fine," became your shield, even when it wasn't true. Then there's the pressure of comparison. A louder sibling making everyone laugh. A confident cousin who always impressed the adults. A classmate praised for being bold. No one said you were not enough, but you absorbed the message anyway. Sensitive children don't fight for attention, they retreat. You became the easy one, the quiet one who didn't disrupt anything. Not because that was your nature, but because shrinking felt safe. Conditional love shapes quietness too. Maybe affection appeared only when you behaved perfectly and vanished when you cried or disagreed. You learned to study faces the way other kids studied homework. The rule became stay agreeable, avoid disappointment. It followed you into adulthood, turning your kindness into self-erasing patterns. Some kids grow up in homes filled with tension, the clatter of dishes that meant stress, the long silence at dinner, the sigh that told you to stay small. You learned to sense a mood shift in seconds. That vigilance protected you then, but now it drains you in moments that shouldn't be stressful at all. And in some homes, everything is controlled: what you say, how you say it, when you feel. Questions felt risky, honesty felt dangerous, so silence became your safest option. Not because you were born quiet, but because staying small was the only way your younger self knew how to survive. When you grow up learning to stay small, you don't just become quiet, you become careful. It shows up in subtle moments, like standing in a group conversation and feeling your throat tighten before you speak, or lying in bed replaying a sentence you said hours earlier, wondering if it sounded wrong. On the outside, people think you're calm. On the inside, you're scanning every expression in the room, checking if it's safe to exist. That's not just your personality. That's a nervous system shaped by years of emotional unpredictability. In fact, researchers at the University of Wisconsin found that children exposed to inconsistent emotional responses develop heightened vigilance as adults, a kind of constant internal watchfulness. One of the deepest costs of this early vigilance is how hard it becomes to express your needs. You might sit on the edge of your bed after a long day, exhausted, wishing someone would notice how tired you are. But you say nothing. You hope people will guess. When they don't, it quietly confirms the belief you learned as a child. Your needs don't matter as much. This leads to relationships where you pour yourself out while receiving little in return, not because you prefer it that way, but because you never learned how to ask. Another cost is the instinct to apologize for existing. You say sorry when someone bumps into you. You say sorry for needing a minute, for having feelings, for taking space in a room. This reflex didn't come from humility, it came from survival. As a child, quick apologies prevented conflict. Now, they slip out of your mouth before you even think. You're not weak, you're trained. There's also that soft, familiar ache of pulling back the moment someone gets close. Maybe you're sitting on a couch with someone who genuinely cares and you feel yourself retreat just a little. You share a small piece of yourself, then you retreat again. You're not cold, you're protecting yourself from the old pattern where closeness meant inconsistency or criticism. Even now, you long for deep connection, yet safety still wins over vulnerability. And then comes people-pleasing, the ability to shape-shift depending on who's in the room. You walk into a gathering and immediately tune into the mood, adjusting your tone so no one feels uncomfortable. You smooth edges, soften opinions, and make yourself easy to be around. People praise you for being understanding, but they don't realize how much emotional labor happens silently inside you. This is a skill you learned early, when upsetting a parent even slightly felt dangerous. The hardest cost, though, is the self-doubt that never seems to fully fade. You might stand in front of a bathroom mirror and wonder if you're good enough, not because anyone said you weren't today, but because your childhood praise came rarely, while criticism came quickly. Even your strengths feel questionable, like you're waiting for someone to expose the flaws you're sure everyone else can see. But the hopeful truth is this: nothing you struggle with is a flaw. It's a response, a beautifully intelligent survival response to the emotional world you grew up in. And once you understand that, something inside you gently shifts. You stop blaming yourself. You begin to see your quiet not as a weakness, but as a story. And you slowly start asking with tenderness, which parts of me kept me safe back then, and which parts am I finally ready to grow beyond now? Healing from this kind of quiet never begins with suddenly becoming loud. It starts in the smallest, softest corners of your day, like when you're sitting alone in your room scrolling your phone and someone knocks on the door without warning. Your heart jumps before you even speak. That tiny jolt of fear, that's not just how you are. That's your childhood echoing through your body. Psychology calls this implicit memory your nervous system, replaying old patterns written before you could name them. Healing begins the moment we stop blaming ourselves for reactions our younger selves created to survive. The first shift often arrives out of nowhere, maybe while washing dishes, staring out a window, or lying awake at 2 a.m., a quiet realization surfaces. I became quiet because it felt safer. And when you acknowledge it, something inside softens. It feels like turning on a lamp in a dark hallway you've walked through for years. The shame loosens. The self-blame fades. Your silence stops looking like weakness and starts looking like wisdom. Your younger self trying to protect you in the only way they knew. Naming isn't just awareness, it's permission to grow. Then comes micro-expression, the gentle ways you let yourself exist again. Think of standing at a cafe counter and choosing a drink you actually like instead of saying whatever's fine. Or texting a friend, "I'm tired today, can we talk later?" These small choices feel fragile, but they teach your body something new. Expressing yourself doesn't break anything. Sometimes it makes life easier. This is how rewiring begins, not with big breakthroughs, but with repetitive, quiet courage. Another shift appears when you notice yourself shrinking. Someone interrupts you and your whole body wants to disappear, but instead of collapsing inward, you pause 2 slow seconds. You feel your feet. You take a breath. Neuroscientist Stephen Porges calls this neuroception, your body's instinctive way of sensing danger. That pause tells your nervous system, this moment isn't like before. I don't have to vanish. That pause becomes your small rebellion. Soon you begin forming gentle boundaries, the kind you didn't know you were allowed to have. At a family dinner, you say, "I'll answer that later." You step outside for a breath. You take breaks without apologizing. These tiny boundaries feel like telling your younger self, you're allowed to exist without shrinking. Then emotions return slowly, like a thaw after a long winter. Sadness sits beside you and you don't push it away. Anger flickers and you don't swallow it whole. Joy shows up unannounced. For years, numbness looked like calm because numbness kept you safe. But true calm is the ability to feel without fear. And eventually, quietly, you sense your quiet changing. It stops being armor and becomes presence. You're still thoughtful, still deep, still observant, but no longer hidden. Your voice returns gently. Solitude nourishes rather than shelters you, and in that new quiet, the quiet you choose, you finally feel like yourself again. There's a moment in healing that often arrives quietly, maybe when you're sitting alone in your living room at night, the lamp casting a soft circle of light, the rest of the house silent. And suddenly, you feel it. The quiet inside you doesn't belong to your childhood anymore. For years, your silence felt like that dim hallway you used to walk through as a kid, tiptoeing to avoid anyone noticing you. It was a shield, a small safety you built before you even knew what safety meant. But now, as an adult, you start noticing moments where your voice doesn't feel like a risk. That's the shift. Your quiet stops being inherited and slowly becomes chosen. When your quiet still belonged to your parents, it felt heavy, like carrying a backpack full of stones no one else could see. You stayed careful in conversations, always watching faces, the way a child watches a door to see who's coming through it. You avoided attention because being noticed once brought criticism or tension. Quiet was survival. It wasn't your personality, it was your protection, your childhood armor. But when quiet becomes yours, it feels different. Picture yourself sitting on your bed in the early morning, wrapped in a blanket, holding a warm cup of coffee. This kind of quiet doesn't suffocate you. It holds you. It becomes a soft place to land instead of a place to hide. You close the door, not because you're scared of the world, but because you finally know how to give yourself peace. Then your relationships begin to change too. You stop being magnetized to people who repeat the emotional patterns you grew up with, the interrupters, the dismissive talkers, the ones who only felt comfortable when you were silent. Instead, you find yourself drawn to people who speak gently, who pause when you pause, who make room for your thoughts without rushing you. Neuroscientist Dr. Dan Siegel calls this earned secure attachment, when adult relationships slowly heal the wounds that childhood ones left behind. Quiet no longer keeps you safe from people. It helps you choose better ones. And little by little, you become more grounded. Imagine standing in a conversation where you would have once shrank back, but now your shoulders stay relaxed, your breath steady. You pause, not because you're afraid, but because you're thoughtful. You choose solitude not to escape, but to recharge. Your quiet becomes intentional, steady, even confident. Your creativity wakes up too. The parts of you that used to hide begin to stretch like they're seeing sunlight for the first time in years. You start journaling again. You imagine. You dream. You notice small things, the way morning light spills across your kitchen counter, the way someone softens when they feel understood. Your inner world stops being a hiding place and becomes a garden you grow from. And finally, something beautiful happens. You meet the version of yourself who existed before you learned to shrink. The kid who talked freely, the kid who felt everything deeply, the kid who wanted to be seen. Healing doesn't turn you into someone new. It lets you return to someone honest. So when the quiet finally belongs to you, you don't disappear. You settle into yourself. You choose depth without losing presence. You speak softly without apologizing. You rest without guilt. Your introversion becomes clarity, not a wound, but a home. Your quiet has carried so much more than most people will ever know. And now that you see its story, you get to shape the next chapter with softness, not fear. If this video felt comforting or familiar, you're welcome to stay here with us. There's more healing, more understanding, more calm waiting for you. Subscribe if it feels right, share it with someone who might need it, and keep being kind to the parts of you that are just beginning to feel safe.